The second of the two British capital ships lost in 4C, HMS Repulse is the rather less famous of the two. Even so, Repulse has a story to tell in her own right. She went into that battle with only limited modernizations, and proceeded to survive longer than she had any right to. She would dodge enough torpedoes to make any ship jealous. She made fools of the Japanese attackers for quite some time. One can say that she was a master of evasion for most of that engagement. It should thus be little surprise that 4C is what she is ultimately best remembered for, even if she is still less famous than Prince of Wales. However, she served for decades before then, and it is important to remember that service as well. Her story began, along with her sister Renown, as an improved version of the Revenge-class battleship, for a certain value of improved, as this design, among other things, reduced the installed power of the ship, and, by extension, the speed of an already slow ship. This planned design would prove to be short-lived, however, as it became apparent the ships could not be finished during the Great War, and the Royal Navy had enough issues with construction as it was. This would probably have been where Repulse's story ended, if not for Admiral Jackie Fisher entering the picture. Through relentless lobbying by Fisher and other serving officers, an agreement was reached. The materials already gathered for Renown and Repulse would be repurposed into a new battlecruiser design. In light of the early war successes for British battlecruisers, it was easier to get authorization for more of those than more of the Revenge class. Under this new design, HMS Repulse was laid down on January 25, 1915. In classic Fisher style, she would be built at a breakneck pace, entering the water a little less than a year later on January 8, 1916. This fast pace of construction continued into her fitting out, as Repulse would commission into the Royal Navy just a few months later in August of 1916. Even at that speed, though, she commissioned too late to see the Battle of Jutland, for better or worse. This is something of a shame, as Repulse was a superior ship to any battlecruiser at that battle, in everything but number of gun barrels, and in the case of the Splendid Cats, raw armor thickness. Arguably her secondary battery, too, as we'll get into. Repulse, in her initial layout, displays 32,000 tons at full load. That displacement allowed for 3 twin turrets, each carrying 2 15-inch rifles. With a total of 6 of these guns, Repulse lacked 1 turret and 2 guns on the contemporary battleships, be they Revenge or Queen Elizabeth. However, this was still a powerful broadside for the time. The guns were carried in the traditional, by that point, layout of main battery turrets, just missing one. She had 2 twin turrets mounted ahead of her superstructure in a super-firing pair. Her third turret was mounted far to the aft, and all on its own, due to the lack of a 4th turret. Supporting these were rather less impressive 4-inch weapons that had largely been replaced on Royal Navy capital ships by that point. This reversion to a smaller weapon was, according to Burt, pushed by Fisher, who disliked the heavier secondary batteries on capital ships. No matter the reason why, Repulse would end up carrying 17 such weapons in 5 triple and 2 single mounts. The triples were an attempt to create a more efficient secondary battery, concentrating the guns and reducing interference in firing arcs. In practice, the mounts proved unwieldy, a problem only made worse by requiring 23 loaders per mount. Or 23 crew in any event, as sources differ here on exactly what their jobs were. Regardless, it caused issues with speed of loading, from everyone getting in each other's way, as you could probably expect. Rounding out her weaponry were 2 single 3-inch anti-aircraft guns and 2 submerged torpedo tubes. A fairly typical thing for the time on both counts. As for her armor, the best I can say is, at least it was thicker than Courageous. At a maximum thickness of 6 inches on the belt, these ships were a callback to an earlier time in battlecruiser protection. At the very least, though, Repulse was faster than her predecessors, at roughly 32 knots on 112,000 shaft horsepower. As such, she outpaced any capital ship in the world until the construction of HMS Hood. To wrap things up, Repulse would receive the first flying off platforms fitted to a capital ship in the autumn of 1917. One was fitted to her B turret, and then another to the Y turret. These allowed her to carry light aircraft, though it was very much an experimental thing, with no way to recover said aircraft. Unfortunately for her, though, all of those technical details did not have much impact on her service life. She wouldn't really get to put any of it to use, at least in the Great War. Not terribly surprising, considering she missed Jutland, but still worth noting. Repulse would, in fact, only see one engagement, and even this was a small one. At the Second Battle of Heligoland Bight, Repulse led the British in engaging German minesweeping forces. Taking place on November 17, 1917, Repulse's portion of the battle was an incredibly lopsided one. While the British light cruisers would engage German battleships, Repulse engaged the German minesweeper forces, which only had 4 light cruisers and 8 destroyers for escort. Predictably, the Germans fled when the British opened fire. Repulse, as a fast and heavily armored ship, detached from the British formation in hot pursuit. In spite of firing 54 main battery shells, she would only succeed in 1 hit on a light cruiser that did relatively little damage. That being said, at least Repulse got to engage in combat. That's more than can be said for a lot of ships in the later portion of the Great War. It's just that this would be her only time to fight the High Seas Fleet, as following this, Repulse moved to a period of refits and patrol duty that would see her miss any other chances at the Germans. Such was her lack of combat action that the only damage she took during World War I was a collision with HMAS Australia on December 12, 1917. Oops. The next and last time that Repulse would see German capital ships came when she was present for the surrender of the High Seas Fleet in November 1918. After that, she entered into what is, for the most part, a fairly standard interwar career, with a couple notable exceptions. First and foremost, before the High Seas Fleet had even scuttled itself, Repulse entered into a major refit on December 17, 1918. This refit was extensive enough that it would last into the tail end of 1920, as it turned out. This refit was primarily concerned with rectifying her armor protection, something that had been desired from basically the moment she entered service. But, as the length of this refit demonstrates, would have taken far too long during wartime. The biggest change would see her 6-inch armor belt removed and replaced by a new 9-inch belt made of armored plates initially intended for the Chilean battleship Almirante Cochrane, which was rather busy being converted to the HMS Eagle, and as such did not need her armor plates. Unlike her sister here, Repulse would end up retaining her original armor belt, even though it was removed in place of the thicker armor. Instead of just being removed entirely, it was moved 1 deck higher, with the new armor in its original place beneath it. This did give her added protection, though there was a cost in weight, in addition to sitting lower in the water. The remainder of the refit, in terms of protection, saw extra deck armor and new anti-torpedo bulges. Those bulges were based on those fitted to Ramillies, and were a good 6 feet wider than the original protection fitted to Repulse. As for weaponry, her submerged torpedo tubes were removed, with armor plates replacing them, and replaced by 8 above-water torpedo tubes. These were divided between 4 twin mountings, with 2 on either side of the ship. Upon completion of this refit, Repulse returned to service with the Battlecruiser Squadron in January 1921. That service would, as previously mentioned, be broadly in line with most ships in the period between the World Wars. Repulse trained her crews, visited foreign ports, and generally did the kind of things that capital ships at peace are wont to do. Soon after recommissioning, she joined Hood on a world cruise in November 1923. Following that came a short refit to replace her old 3-inch guns, and her single 4-inch guns, with 4 4-inch anti-aircraft weapons. Then came another long cruise, first to Portugal, then across Africa, as she carried around the later King Edward, then the Prince of Wales. This was in 1925. It also saw a squash court, a sauna, and I am not joking when I say this, a bubble bath fitted for the Prince. Once those features were removed upon her return to more traditional service, Repulse would remain with the battlecruiser squadron through the remainder of the 1920s and the start of the 1930s, as Hood underwent a routine refit. Upon Hood's return to service, it would be Repulse's turn to go into refit. This would prove to be a far less extensive sort of thing in comparison to the complete rebuild that her sister Renown would later receive. It was still by no means a minor refit, though. She had yet another modification made to her armor protection. Most of her deck armor was pulled out and replaced by thicker plates of higher quality. In addition to this, her amidships 4-inch triple mount was pulled out and replaced by a fixed catapult. This was joined by a hangar on either side of her rear funnel, allowing Repulse to carry up to 4 scout aircraft. 2 in the hangars, 1 on the catapult, and a final one on the deck. Her anti-aircraft battery would be further reinforced in this refit, as she received 4 prototype 4-inch dual-purpose guns and equally prototyped twin-gun mounts. Supporting these were 2 octuple pom-pom mounts and a pair of quadruple 50 caliber machine gun mounts. This refit would last until 1936, with Repulse joining the Mediterranean Fleet in April of that year. Arriving in June, she would almost immediately get thrown into protecting British interests in the area as a result of the Spanish Civil War. The most notable of her roles here being carrying 500 refugees to France late in the year. Otherwise, not much really happened, at least not in the Mediterranean. She would get to join the coronation review for King George VI in 1937, before getting sent to Palestine in 1938. That was for the latest round of Arab-Jewish conflict, and saw Repulse there mostly to be a sign of British power. After that, it was intended that she return to royal transport duty, carrying the King and Queen to Canada in 1939. Or so the plan went, though with the political situation becoming tenser in Europe, she instead escorted the royals to Canada, and even then only for the first half of the trip. Repulse was needed more for actual combat duty, because by the middle of 1939, it was very apparent that things were coming to a head on the mainland. And when World War II broke out in September, Repulse would almost immediately be sent off to patrol around Norway for German ships. She would remain on similar duties for the entire period between the start of the war and her ill-fated adventure to Singapore in late 1941. In spite of efforts to chase German raiders, Repulse would never actually encounter German forces during the early war period. This ranged from chasing the Scharnhorst sisters to the Panzerschiff, and even participating in the hunt for Bismarck. A good example of her luck in this is that in November 1939, Repulse was damaged by heavy seas and forced to return to port. There were a few breaks in this fruitless action, however, be they refits to increase her anti-aircraft weaponry yet further, or supporting the Norwegian campaign in mid-1940. She would also escort convoys, which would probably have deterred German surface raiders had she run into any of them, which she didn't. As for the aforementioned hunt for Bismarck, Repulse tried to help, but she was in the process of escorting a convoy. As a direct result, she had to break off the search on May 25, 1941, to return to port and refuel. Her last refit would soon follow between June and August, which saw her fit with a surface gunnery radar and a 20mm cannon. It was in this state that Repulse was assigned to Force Z and sent to Singapore in late 1941. This would see her sail with Prince of Wales and escorting destroyers, ostensibly to deter Japan from any offensive actions towards British colonial holdings. As it would turn out, this is a story that has been told many times. Repulse and her battleship companion arrived in Singapore on December 2, 1941. By that point, the Japanese had already set sail to attack Pearl Harbor, and were preparing similar attacks towards Southeast Asia. By the time the British capital ships arrived, they were less a deterrent and more extra targets from the Japanese perspective. This would not be helped by Admiral Phillips sortying on December 8th to try and contest Japanese landings in Malaya. Not inherently a poor decision, though the lack of real understanding of Japanese capabilities made it riskier than it otherwise would have been. as did the lack of air cover that would, ultimately, doom Repulse. I have covered the following operation in greater detail in my Prince of Wales video, which I will link in the description. I will also, at some point or another, do a dedicated video on 4C's unfortunate end. For the purposes of this video, we will focus on Repulse. On December 10th, 1941, Japanese bombers began to attack 4C. This attack began around 11 in the morning, with the first wave being level bombers that, in stark contrast to the usual performance, hit Repulse with a bomb that penetrated through her hangar. 2 other near misses straddled her, which is impressive accuracy in its own right. That one hit did little damage, however, as these were 250 kilogram, 551 pound bombs, and it exploded against her armor deck. Her crew promptly ditched her scout plane to prevent fire from spreading, while the gun crews damaged several of the Japanese bombers. Following this initial attack, multiple waves of Japanese torpedo bombers attacked the 2 ships. Prince of Wales was hit in possibly the worst place she could be, as it caused one of her shafts to run wild and do severe internal damage. Repulse, under her Captain Tennant's deft hand, managed to thread the needle. By the time she was finally hit, the old battlecruiser had dodged no fewer than 19 torpedoes. Just imagine for a moment this nearly 800-foot, 242-meter-long battlecruiser dodging and weaving through air attack, evading almost 20 torpedoes, all while her guns are blazing away. I can only imagine what it would have been like watching that from a Japanese bomber. Unfortunately for all the heroic efforts, the Japanese eventually adapted. With Prince of Wales crippled by that initial hit, they were able to throw something like 17 torpedo bombers at Repulse at once. While Tennant managed to turn his ship to starboard to thread the first wave, the bombers had split into 2 formations. The second one, seemingly going for Prince of Wales, swung around at the last moment. Tennant says they were only 2,000 yards away when they dropped their fish. These torpedoes, coming from port, put Repulse in an impossible position. Attempt to dodge them, and be hit by the first wave. Attempt to thread the first wave, and be hit by the second set. And Repulse would be hit. In short order, up to 5 torpedoes, though there is some argument on the exact number, slammed into her side. While Repulse would shoot down 2 bombers and damage at least 8 more, she was doomed. The old and relatively unmodernized battlecruiser settled quickly, sinking within a few minutes. She would take about 500 men with her, though miraculously about 800 would be plucked from the water in the end. As for the wreck, well, for the longest time, that was a largely undisturbed war grave. In recent years, however, illegal salvagers have been doing what they previously did in the Java Sea, blowing the hull apart and tearing metal away. As of when I recorded the Prince of Wales video, this was nowhere near as bad as the Java Sea wrecks. As of when I upload this video, it is only a month ago that a Chinese salvage ship was found to be tearing apart Repulse and Prince of Wales. All I can say is, it is a shame to see something like this. It really is. Thank you for watching. Remember to like, comment, and subscribe if you enjoy the content, and I'll see you in the next one.